Hello and welcome to Face Off here on France 24. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Paris, the government has first and foremost predictably announced a raft of security measures, more surveillance, tighter monitoring of the internet. But it also wants to take steps in the field of education with proposal to teach more about secular values, about the respect for authority and mutual respect between religions. With me to discuss the next steps after the terrorist attacks, Jean-Marc Gonin with the Figaro magazine and Philippe Turl from Radio France Internationale. But before we go into the field of education, this Tuesday, the Prime Minister Manuel Valls presented his New Year wishes to the media, and he reminded them that the issue of integrating the populations from the so-called suburbs has been at the forefront for nearly 10 years, and he used very strong words to define the situation in those areas. Let's take a listen to Manuel Valls.
I already brought it up during the riots of 2005. There is a social, territorial, and ethnic apartheid that has been forced upon our country. Social misery, and add to that discrimination in everyday life, because we don't have the right surname or the right skin color, or because we're a woman.
Manuel Valls, using very strong words, he talks about apartheid, social, ethnical, and territorial apartheid in some areas of France, and he says it's not new. We tend to realize it only when tragic things happen, like the riots back in 2005 or the terrorist attacks 10 years later. Clearly using that word is not just by happenstance.
Well, he's right about that. There is a major problem facing France's suburbs. Just to give you an example, back in the 1960s, when many of these suburbs were built, they were lived in by French people, and there were some immigrants who'd been brought into this country to do jobs where there were vacancies. Now, 40 years later, the immigrants are still there. They have first, second, third generations of now French national children. But all the French people have moved out. So all the people who were called Jean-François, Dominique, or Pierre don't live there anymore. And you only have these immigrant families. So they're finding themselves in these areas where they feel cut off from the rest of France, where they feel discriminated against, where there's higher unemployment. And it's been a bit like a hot potato that's been passed around from one government to the next, because they don't really know what to do about it. So we have periodically these situations where things get out of control and they explode. In 2005, there were 2 young children who died after being chased by police and were electrocuted in an electricity generating station. And that led to widespread riots in many French suburbs. And at the time, everybody said, this has got to stop. We've got to invest in the suburbs to make them better places to live and to give these people jobs. Here we are 10 years later. I'm a little bit pessimistic about this. We've been round this mulberry bush lots of times. I think there's a lot of good speaking involved, but where the actions are behind, it's complicated. And I fear that once this blows over, we'll be back to square one again.
So pessimistic, Philippe Turl. That being said, can you compare, riots after police incidents like we've seen in many countries, starting with the United States just only recently, and terrorist attacks that were, yes, indeed committed by French nationals who went in and out of those suburbs for many years? And why do you think Manuel Valls, who's been more the law and order persona until now, is speaking about this issue? Does he feel he needs to send a message maybe to those people who live in those areas and say, we're not only going to repress you, we're also going to listen to you and maybe give you some much needed help?
Yes, I think that he has to do that kind of a policy mix to try to appease and find solutions of what's going on. You're perfectly right in saying that riots cannot be compared to what happened in Paris 2 weeks ago, that is terrorism and that kind of a massacre. And I will stress that the Kouachi brothers, who are the main culprits of the who did the massacre at the Charlie Hebdo offices, were born in Paris and are brought up in Paris mostly, or in the provinces, and they've hardly lived in those places Philip was describing. So that's not the only problem. But indeed, there is a kind of apartheid. I would simply correct Philip, in the sense that a lot of money has been invested in between. Especially the last two conservative administrations, Chirac and Sarkozy, have invested a lot, and a lot of renovation has been going on in those suburbs. I mean, the housing situation is much better than it used to be. But there is, as you said, Philip, there is no mix, and you have a kind of, at least a kind of ethnic ghetto that has not been changed. And this is probably the main problem, especially when you look at discrimination, as Valls was saying. For jobs, for instance, you have hundreds of studies proving, without any possibility to contest it, that if you send your resume with an address, of course, first with the name Mohammed, but plus an address in those places, you have no chance to get the job, because your resume will be thrown into the basket by the boss who receives it.
Right. I want to broaden it to the issue of school. This week, the President François Hollande is to give an important speech on youth and the need for education. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether all the problem of those people who feel alienated and sometimes can go to places like Syria and come back with some terrorist projects need to learn better things at school. And so there's a lot of talk about singing the national anthem in school, talking about more about secularism. Is this of any value, or do you think it's just the government hyperventilating and trying to say we're going to do something?
Well, there are two things. First one is the government's got to say something, because there is this expectation from the French people that now something's got to be done. So if the government doesn't say anything, the government's going to fall in popularity. We've seen this huge boost in popularity for President Hollande.
Plus 20 points, historical.
21 points. He would like to keep it. So obviously they're going to have to say something to placate this desire for people for things to change. But the problem is, what do we do? How are we going to change things rapidly so that there is a marked improvement that people can tangibly see, and they will get the feeling that the things are going in the right direction? Okay, looking at schools in this country, I think there's been, over the years, a certain laxism that has been left the possibility to introduce itself into schools. There's been lack of training of teachers, there's been reduction of budgets, there have been certain measures to make discipline maybe not quite so important in schools, so children have been able to do more things that in the old days they wouldn't have been allowed to do, or behave more badly in class. And we saw last week, when there was a minute's silence for the victims of Charlie Hebdo, that in numerous schools around the country, some of the pupils didn't pay any respect to that.
I will just going to take a listen to some declaration by the Education Minister Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, who had some proposals to make. Let's see if they can fly.
What students are suffering from is the loss of points of reference, the question of having rituals at school, the question of respect for authority. Yes, we have to look at that. There are things like this which, for me, should not be taken lightly, because we also need to teach pupils respect, respect for the rule of law, respect for authority.
Jean-Marc Gonin, respect, rule of law, authority, those are words you don't necessarily hear from a socialist education minister.
Precisely. Well, as everyone knows, the Socialist Party has a strong basis among teachers in this country. And those teachers have been pretty anti-authoritarian in the last decades. And now it's a kind of rollback policy, and that is being implemented by their own party, so to speak, by the Socialist Party. And it's going to be a hard nut to crack, because those teachers have been, in my eyes, very, very tolerant with many things that were happening inside schools, challenging...
especially in those suburbs we're talking about.
Exactly. And on the top of that, the unions, the teachers' unions, have been very reluctant to send experienced teachers in those schools. I mean, beginners were usually sent to those schools. I mean, with kind of libertarian methods plus lack of experience, you imagine the cocktail in front of that kind of kids who were pretty hard to be taught.
Well, they're saying things like, well, in the old days we would have had the authority to deal with these children. Now we don't. And many of the teachers are saying because we can't do anything, we have no authority anymore. And we're in this rather ridiculous situation where in the old days, the teacher had complete control over the class. The teacher had the final word over what the pupil did. And if the pupil got into trouble with the teacher when the pupil got home, there was a chance they would also get into trouble with their parents. Now we're in this situation that if the teacher tells the child off, the child will go home and the parent will come back and tell the teacher off. So they can't install this situation of discipline because the children know that they have more authority, if you like, than the teacher. So I think what needs to be done in the first instance is definitely to put back some kind of authority into the classroom. It's very complicated. They have to understand that it's the French Republic which has the final word that sets the rules, and they have to obey those rules. But I don't think that's going to be enough in the long term. I think that the government needs to take further steps to invest more money in poorer areas, in schools in poorer areas, pay for more teachers, give them better education. And I think even something that they could contemplate doing is, I think in some cases, some of the parents ought to be properly trained to look after their children, because it's the parents who are ultimately responsible, and sometimes the parents aren't doing a good job.
Very quickly, so the new Marshall plans for the suburbs, for schools, I mean,
That's
those are sometimes empty words.
Empty words. Yeah. Well, again, the chest is quite empty to have a Marshall Plan for the suburbs, unfortunately. So we'll have to do with what's left in the public finances, and that's not much.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll have to see how this flies in schools in France, and we'll have to see what the president will propose this week. Thank you very much for watching this edition of Face Off. Stay tuned here on France 24 for more news.